So good afternoon and welcome everyone to this second seminar of the 2023 ESPRit seminar series. I'm Mara Logaldo from University Milan, and I'm particularly proud and excited to chair today's seminar, and mainly for two reasons. The first one is that, of course, that it is held by outstanding scholars in the field of periodical studies, British, French, and German culture and literature, comparative literature, and translation studies. And the second one is that translation is also my research area, so I'm particularly grateful to Andrew Thacker, Marina Popea, Dana Steglich, and Alison E. Martin for sharing the outcome of their research, showing how this methodological approach can shed light not only on linguistic and translational issues, but also on broadly cultural, political, and social ones. Indeed, the title powerfully underlines the idea of translation as a space to be explored. So although we all very well know today's presenters, we know their research areas, their publications, I would like to briefly introduce them. Andrew Thacker is Professor of English Literature at Nottingham, Trent University. He's among the most distinguished experts in modernism, broadly conceived, but with a focus on institutions of modernism, such as magazines and bookshops. He was a founding member and the first chair of the British Association for Modernist Studies. He is co-editor of the interdisciplinary journal Literature and History and of the Palgrave Material Modernism book series. He has published extensively, so it would be impossible to mention all his publications, but I will mention his latest monograph, Modernism, Space and the City, published by Edinburgh University Press in 2019. The first book to bring affect, theory, and literary geography together to analyze modernism. So welcome, Professor Thacker. It's an honor to have you here today. Marina Popea is research fellow also at NTU. She specializes in translation and cultural magazines with a broad comparative focus. She's particularly interested in Mexican cultural magazines and the methodological challenges of studying translation in the context of periodical publications, and is developing digital humanities tools to integrate quantitative analysis into her research. Among her recent publications, a contribution to the volume Literary Translation in Periodicals, published by John Benjamins in 2020. Dana Steglich, hello Dana, is a research fellow in comparative literature at the Johannes Gutenberg-Universität Mainz, but she's also worked as an editor and literary agent. She's focused her research on Shakespeare, Jean-Marie Tolkien, and has recently published a monograph on the poetics of escapism in the works of Anglo-Irish writer Lord Anthony, published by Winter in 2022. Unfortunately, Alison E. Martin has not been able to join us today, but as she's one of the core members of this project group, I would like to say a few words about her too. She's Professor of British Studies at the University of Mainz and is a specialist in translation studies, travel writing, and comparative literature. She's published numerous monographs and articles on translation and travel writing in 18th and 19th century British, Dutch, and German literature. And she has recently co-edited a special issue of modernist cultures on the theme of global modernisms. So I don't want to take up more time. So I will just say that the seminar is conceived as a joint presentation of various aspects of a whole project carried out by a research group rather than 3 individual papers. And this is the reason why we don't have different titles, but one title, which is Spaces of Translation, European Magazine Culture, 1945-1965. So please keep your mics mics muted during the presentation. We're going to have a discussion, and we are going to have a Q&A session after that. And you can either post your questions in the chat or ask them directly at the end of the session. But of course, you can write your comments in the chat anytime. So thank you. I'll leave you the floor and enjoy this seminar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mara, for that very generous introduction. So just let me explain how we're going to do this. We're going to talk in sequence. So I'm going to start off by talking a little bit generally about the project. Then Marina will take over and talk about a different aspect, followed by Dana, another aspect, and then I'll come back and just wind things up. So we hope that gives you a bit of an overview of the different things we've been doing with the project. And just to reiterate that, unfortunately, Alison is unable to be here, but she had definitely contributed to the discussions and is essential to this project. So, okay, so right, go back. So the project is based on the translation European magazine Cultures 1945 to 1965. We have a nice map from one of the magazines that we're looking at there, which I very much like. So what we're going to do then is give an introduction to the project, talk a little bit as an overview, talk about the staffing, the web presence, some of the key kind of questions that we're trying to address in the project. Then we're going to move on, and Marina will do some work, talk about the work that we've been doing on data and digital humanities approaches. Then we're going to shift to Dana, who's going to talk a little bit about the archival material that herself and Marina both had a look at, and she's going to focus on the German magazine Der Monat. Then I'm going to do a little section on an individual in the magazine, Stephen Spender, an encounter, just to talk about some of the other issues that we're interested in the project. So you can see it's a very kind of multi-dimensional project in terms of approaches and so on. So we're hoping to give you a kind of flavor of that in this presentation. Okay, some central questions that I think we're trying to explore then in the project. The first one, I suppose, the origin of it was how periodical culture in Britain, France, and Germany used translation to reconfigure a vision for Europe after the catastrophe of World War II. When myself and Alison were conceiving the project, we wanted to look at the period after World War II, a period I think we were both, in terms of magazines and periodicals, less familiar with, and really less work has been done on that period than for 20th century people, the interwar years or the late 19th century and so on. So it was a kind of new period for us to look at, and I think we've been fascinated by what we've found. We're also very interested in clearly what happens to European identity here. So we picked three language areas to focus on. That was partly about our expertise and just making the project manageable for a kind of 3-year funded project. We've broadly used three interlinked perspectives, I think, in the project. One is political, looking at the political questions that are raised by periodical culture in Europe at this point. The second is translational, and there's a really strong focus, of course, on the translated material in the magazines. And then finally, I think material, the materiality, the print culture aspects of the magazines is also something we looked at. These are, as we said, interlinked. And again, I hope we give some indication of that in the presentation today. And I think a final question picking up on those issues is, we want to address how did journals function as platforms for the discussion of what European identity had come to represent, and to envisage new futures for European identities after 1945. I suppose it would come as no surprise that two British people, myself and Alison, were interested in European identity after the Brexit vote, and wanted to go back and look at some of the debates around European identity and maybe as how we got to the point that we're in today. Okay, so there's some central questions. Here are some of the topics, I suppose, that have looked at, we've come up with that we've been exploring just as kind of headings, really. And I won't really go into these too much. Some of them are very familiar for anybody working on periodicals, so the relationship between journal and book markets, materiality, ephemerality, and so on. Some are quite specific for this period. Decolonization and Americanization, for example. We're looking at a period after 1945 when the major European powers have to give up their colonies through a long process of struggle of decolonization. So that's a kind of an interesting dynamic that we see in the magazines. And one of the magazines we're looked at there is Présence Africaine, which really kind of focuses on those questions. And just to flag up another one there, Americanization, the Cold War. Clearly, this is a key period for the development of the Cold War and the impact of America in Europe after 1945. Particularly, of course, we think of the economics of the Marshall Plan, but as we're also kind of finding out the kind of cultural influence of Americanization and American culture is a central one to a number of the magazines in this period. So that, as I said, just to flag up some of the topics we're exploring. Just some about the mechanics of the project. The funding period is 2021 to 2024, and this was funded by a grant from the UK and German funding councils, the AHRC and the DFG, for which we're very grateful. The staffing that we've had so far, myself and Alison are the PIs in the two countries. Killian O'Fai was the first research fellow, then he's been replaced by Marina, who we're going to hear from in a minute. And in Germany, to work with Alison has been Dana, who we'll also hear from. So that's the kind of setup. I should say there's also an advisory board, of which some of the members of ESPRit have been very helpful in giving us advice on various things. So I just want to say thank you to them while we're talking about the staffing. Just a little bit about where you can find more information about what we're up to. We have a website, which at the moment is just advertising the work of the project and got some other kind of information. We've got a series of blogs on there from various people involved in the project or people that have come and seen or participated. And I think I would say Dana is in charge of those. We'd be happy for people to volunteer and come along and talk to us, about an idea for a blog that relates to, something to do with spaces of translation in European magazine culture. And then finally, we've also got a presence on Twitter where we can advertise what we're up to. In the course of time, this website will be replaced by a large one that contains all of the data that we're going to talk about in a little while. So this is a kind of holding place that's got a lot of stuff that's very interesting, advertising the workshops and so on, but it will be supplemented by this a larger website coming soon. Okay, and then the final bit, I think, for me before I pass over is just the corpus that we have settled on. We settled on for this project, and I just wanted to say a couple of things about this. As I said, we picked the 3 language areas, partly due to expertise, knowledge, and it was manageable. But we're also interested in translation in those magazines from other language areas, obviously. We picked 8 from each language area, again to keep it somewhat manageable, though there were days I was looking through Le Table Ronde yesterday thinking, God, there's a lot of stuff in here. Now I'm thinking maybe we should have cut down some of these, but anyway, we're trying to look at all of these in some way. I should just explain the first and second tier ranking that we use when we were drawing up the project initially. It's both a kind of got a quantitative dimension and maybe a qualitative dimension. It's quantitative in the sense that the ones in the top row have longer print runs. I mean, they're going across a number of years. Le Temps Moderne, you see, it went up to 2019. We're only looking at the period 45 to 65. Again, it was thinking, okay, it's manageable 20-year period, but also there's a sense in which I feel from the 60s onwards, things change very much in print culture, periodicals, wider culture. So we thought that we would stop there. So at one level, those top tier are magazines that go on for a long time, but they're also ones that have been acknowledged as being qualitatively important. I mean, Le Temps Moderne is a touchstone for radical thought in France with de Beauvoir and Sartre at the front of it. In the second tier, the magazines are often shorter print runs. You'll see some have only like 6 or 7 copies, so they're more like some of the little magazines of the pre-war years, but some are not. Some do go for longer periods, but they're smaller and they've perhaps been a little bit overlooked. So that's what we call them second tier. But we want to kind of also address them and see what's in them. That's not to say we're not focusing on those, because we've done quite a lot of work on a number of these. So that's the kind of introduction. I think we're now over to Marina, and I'm going to just move the slides along as and when we need them moving.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Andrew. So yes, to follow from what you said about the corpus, with this corpus as a starting point, our next step has been to find out literally what has been translated in each magazine. And the best solution to keep track of all the information was to work with tables, as many researchers working with translation magazines have found to be helpful. And this also draws, I believe, to some extent, on a certain tradition of publishing indexes, both in periodical studies and translation studies. But adopting a tabular digital format for this data also makes it much easier to both share and use, so to filter, wrangle, and analyze and visualize, as we will see in a second. So our goal really with these tables is to create a database, and as Andrew said a second ago, to make it accessible and fully searchable online on the website that we're working towards at the moment. Just 2 caveats before I go further. So this slide and the next correspond to our input spreadsheets. So it's the tables that we work with when we enter the data. The final idea is to work with a graph database in the end. So the variables will be the same, but the format will be different. And the second one is that all examples, except actually this one that you can see on the slide at the moment, are from German magazines. This is because that's the area in which our collection and tidying of the data is almost finalized, and we can finally have kind of like a bigger picture of what is going on in those magazines. Ultimately, we'll do this across the whole corpus. So what you see at the moment on the screen is an example of the translations dataset for the English magazine Encounter. Each row corresponds to one translation, or as you can see as well, one issue that has no translation at all in it, and that's, for instance, rows 3 and 4, and the 4 rows towards the end that say none. And that's also important in order to record when were translations actually published and when there was actually nothing. And the variables that we record, as you can see, are the journal in which the translation appeared, the year, the issue, so that we have an issue ID to actually keep track of that, the volume, the issue number, then the listed translator and the translator. I'll come back to this in a second. The author, the title of the translated text, its genre, the source language, the target language, and then a few notes whenever we've been able to either trace an original or this kind of information. We faced a number of challenges, obviously, while building this database, as anyone working with data will be fully aware. One of which is the definition of the genre, and that's something that I've discussed also in the past with scholars working on translation in periodicals in particular. It is always the question of how granular do you want to make it to actually reflect things that are going on in the magazines, but in a way that is still usable and practicable when collecting the data. So the solution that we've come up with so far is to work with a kind of simplified system for the genre that really considers broad categories. So we have poetry, fictional prose, non-fictional prose, drama, and then life writing and quotation and book reviews, which are the slightly less common ones. Quotations in particular is because some of the magazines use kind of like short quotes to fill in blank space on some of their pages, and they constitute really a category that has to be set apart, and that is necessary to filter out sometimes. Even with this system, we still kind of like encounter some questions, such as, kind of like, what do you do with prose poetry? Where do we put that kind of thing? And those are discussions that we have at almost all our meetings, and which we obviously are documenting, and which will be published as a data paper when the database itself is live. The second challenge is the high rate of anonymity for translators, and that would be the next slide, please. So as you can see here, we have an example. No, sorry, not the next slide, actually.
Just that one.
As you can see here, so on the second row, there seems to be a broad tendency in our corpus that translations are mostly invisible, despite the really substantial contribution. And this is one of the reasons why we have those two columns. So one of them, listed translator, is to record whether there is a translator mentioned in the magazine at all. And the second one is in case, so translator is in case we are able to identify a translator through other means. And that can be through archival material. For the French magazine Preuve, for instance, I've been able to trace a series of receipts when certain translators were paid. That also mentioned the title or the author of the text that they translated. So that way we're able to reconstruct a bit the identity of the translators who are not mentioned in the magazines, but who did nevertheless work with them. Or for instance, we've been also able in a number of instances to trace the translation to kind of like a published volume during the same period, and corroborate that this is actually the same text that was published. And it was identified in a case and anonymous in the magazine. And we've kept both columns because actually working with the listed translator column, we're able to see what proportion is of the translations is actually acknowledged as such, and it will allow us to discuss some questions such as, are certain genres or certain kinds of translators or certain languages kind of like more likely to be presented anonymously, and are others more likely to be identified. Yeah, next slide. So in relation to this question of who the translators are, we are also compiling a data set and tracking and recording information about the translators themselves. through the table that you can see here. So it contains the name of the translators, their pseudonyms, dates of birth and death, nationality, gender, and the journals that they work for, as well as a short biographical note. In these examples, and in this example that you see here from German magazine Carousel, we see that, I mean, we observe a number of things. One of them, and that's kind of like next click, a good proportion of translators are not very well known at all. In fact, we haven't been able to find any information about them, and we're still digging, but that also goes to show that a number of these people involved in the work of magazines were not particularly prominent figures in the literary world. The second thing, and that's the next, is that a good proportion of the translators are women, and that they tended to carry out a part of kind of like this mediator work in the magazines. And this will be, I expect, an important line of inquiry in the project, in terms of also seeing, are these women translators anonymous more often than others? Who are they? Where are they coming from? Again, for the magazine Preuve, I have a bit of archival evidence that will show that often some writers' wives are working as translators for magazines, and that there's a whole kind of like network there, where women are working in these predominantly invisible positions, but that are pulling a lot of the weight of the translational work in these magazines. And then the next thing that we observe as well, and that's next still, that a number of translators are members of the Eastern European diaspora, and this really resonates with the idea that is put forward by Anthony Beam in translation studies, that translators tend to belong to what he calls intercultures, so areas that where different cultures intersect, and that translators tend to assume an intercultural identity. And this is a very interesting, I think, concept to think about translation in periodicals as spaces of translation in a period of, post-war and Cold War conflicts. But it's also challenging from a number of points of view. And I'm just illustrating this very quickly with the case of Anna Halia, or Halina Luciak, who is a very good example of this, not only because so she emigrates from actually Romania and acquires German citizenship, as we can see in the nationality column. So she has dual nationality there, and she's listed as having two nationalities, but also because while she's of Ukrainian descent, she was born in Romania. She was part of the ethnic minority of Ukrainian people in Romania. So this really bears the question of how do we list her nationality, and how do we prioritize this kind of thing. And these are kind of questions that come up over and over again when working with these communities of people who are displaced and who exist in this interculture of exiled communities, but also who come from Eastern European countries that already have a quite multicultural dimension to them, and different groups of populations within them. So that's something that we've not completely solved in all cases, and that we keep actively thinking about, especially in order to kind of like really do justice to this incredibly rich and complex situation of these people who exist and who move almost seamlessly between cultures. So as we see, we gather data that is incredibly rich and interesting, and that can be combined and analyzed in many different ways. The first one is a qualitative approach, in which we would filter things out in the data set, and then look at a smaller set of texts. And for instance, one example of this could be to filter out all the translations made by a certain translator, or all the all the translations of the works of a certain author. And that can, for instance, help examine how certain texts did circulate across linguistic boundaries during the time. And this is particularly important at a time when we're talking about the construction of European identities, and the fact that certain articles about the topic in particular were pushed by groups who had political interests, and were widely translated across our language areas as a way to actually share those ideas about European identity and political options for the future. The other option to analyze this data is quantitative. So the idea being to visualize bigger chunks of data and find broad trends within them. In this area, we follow the general principle of exploratory data analysis, as outlined by John Tukey. So the starting point is the most general view of the data possible. And then the process is to refine it progressively until we get to kind of like more granular information on specific aspects that we find in the big picture. The second element put forward by Tukey is the importance of visualizing data. And he argues on this particular point that it's particularly crucial to use visualization because it does show also things that you do not expect when you have only the data. And I'll illustrate this in a second. So of course, we're somewhat limited by the fact that almost all our variables are categorical and not numerical, so we cannot do a whole lot of calculations to them. But there's still plenty of interesting things that we can look at. And that's the next slide, please. So the first category of plots that we can generate, and that's probably as general as we get, is a frequency bar plot. The idea ultimately is to have this kind of indicators done across the whole corpus, so the 3 language areas, and then for each language area, and then for specific magazines, to be able to really see how they compare to the big picture and how they compare to each other in terms of which variables are more represented. And here the example is language. So we see that for the German language area, the most represented languages are British English, American English, French, Italian, and then Russian, Spanish, Polish. One of the things that we have found so far across the whole corpus is the incredible richness and unexpected richness of source languages. So far we've found 59 different languages in total. Of course, different magazines will have different degrees of multilingualism and engagement with languages that are not the main ones. But this really has shown a picture in which there is an engagement with a very wide range of linguistic and cultural regions of the world within Europe and outside. So across German magazines, we can see that mostly the translated languages correspond to the occupying powers at the time, with Russian considerably less represented. And this probably speaks also to the political situation and to the attempt to kind of like rebuild the ties between Germany and allied countries in the post-war period. And then, yes, I'll come to this in a second. And then I would like to stress also that this kind of, ranking or proportion of languages or of genres can also be done or plotted over time to see the evolution of these variables over time. And I think we'll have a look at this in a moment in Andrew's part of the presentation, so I don't want to spoil it. yet. So next slide is the same, but with genres. So we also ranked the genres across the German corpus so far. So what we can see now is, you know, a pretty strong focus on non-fictional prose in this case, which again underlines this idea of having kind of like very broad ideological questions and debates going on during the period. And next slide, we can also obviously rank authors, translators, which we can see here, and which shows pretty dramatically the predominance of anonymous translators so far. And I would like to look at one specific example as well, and that's Eric Fried, who is one of our most prolific translators in the German corpus. And exactly, next slide. So, and who is an Austrian writer who was exiled in England during the war at a very young age, in his 20s. He was one of the members of a group of very young exiles who worked across a range of cultural institutions. And one of his contributions was his translations during the period. He also developed at the same time kind of his own career as a writer and a poet. Next, please. So what's interesting is that because he appears in that ranking of translators, we can see that he's one of the contributors that is more often not named as a translator, and we find that a vast majority of the translators who are named as translators are working mainly with literary prose or poetry. And that's obviously presumably because they are themselves writers, and this translatorial activity is related to kind of like their own creative project, which in itself will be a hypothesis to test more broadly across the corpus, but which is quite interesting. So if we look at the same computations that we run on the whole corpus, but just on Eric Fried, so that's the next slide, we can see that he tended to work across a variety of languages. So again, British English, American English, Hebrew, and Dutch, and also across a wide variety of genres, with again this focus on fictional prose and poetry. So now we're already kind of like refining this big picture and seeing how the cases of some of the translators who were identified compares to kind of like the big picture. But we can refine it even further if we decide to plot his translations over time, and that's the next slide. And it's interesting, and still next, that this is a kind of visual representation of the data that does not rely on any calculation. So as you can see, it just the x-axis is just a timeline, and the vertical, the y-axis, is the categories of the genres in which are represented in Eric Fried's translations. And I've actually colored this by magazine. So he contributed to 2 different magazines, Neue Auslese, which are the light blue ones, and then Merkur. And we can see that there's a quite dramatic difference between his work for one magazine and the other. And this raises a number of questions. For instance, where does the broad one being, where does this question come from? This difference come from? So is it because of the magazine editors that had a different policy and that required him to do a different kind of work for each one of them? Is it because of the stage of his career that he was at, and that either he was able to refine his own interests and pursue what he was most interested in, or whether he was probably less in need of translating for a living? and didn't have to take so many projects on. So obviously, the data opens all these questions that will have to be explored further qualitatively. But definitely, it shows that although what he translated most was fictional prose in terms of quantity, poetry was kind of like the one constant throughout all his translatorial work for our magazines. Okay, next, I think we'll skip this one. It's the same, but just colored by languages to also see how in time the languages that he tended to work on have shifted. And again, whether this is an effect of kind of like personal interest or magazine policy is still up for debate. And I will close on the last kind of graph that we're considering, and that's networks. Well, actually, it's not exactly the last one. We're also planning on working with maps and, you know, mapping where translations come from in terms of the cultures that they represent, and also where translators come from and how, you know, texts move. So that's definitely something that will be part of the project as well. But we have not been really generating this kind of visualization so far. So networks here, we have each node, so each dot is one translator. And each translator is linked to another translator if they have worked for the same magazine. So this creates, you know, the situation where each bubble is basically a magazine. So each one of the kind of conglomerates of dots. And that's very interesting because I started working on this kind of visualization with a bit of a reservation in terms of how helpful this would be. I mean, obviously, we see that translators are clustered in terms of the magazines that they worked for, which in itself is an observation that has some value in terms of, you know, really showing that magazines tended to have a pool of people who worked for them and that were not widely shared across different magazines often. But besides that, I was wondering to what extent we have kind of like one of those big spaghetti monster situation where we can't really make any inference on this basis. And by the way, one of the yellow dots that's right at the middle, the smaller one at the right at the middle is Eric Fried. So yeah, that one exactly. However, one of the interesting things that I found in this graph when generating it is the two bigger clusters at the top, because these, as you can see, share a lot more translators than other magazines share. So that's Merkur on the left and Monat on the right. And we see the group of yellow dots just in between them that represent all the translators that worked for both magazines. And that's a case that happens in between these two and not really to the same extent between other magazines. And that's particularly interesting because the Monat, as Dana will be telling us in a minute, was a magazine that was subsidized by an organization called the Congress for Cultural Freedom. And because Merkur is not a magazine that is normally associated with this organization, so it really opened the question of what really is the relationship between those magazines and why do they have such an overlap in terms of the translators that they employ. Obviously, this is not an easy question to answer, and it is not answered, but it's definitely one that I had at the back of my mind while going through the archive. And as soon as I saw the word Merkur in documents that were related to their monad, I immediately went back to this image of there is some kind of relationship between these two magazines. And even with the archival material, it is not clear yet what this relationship was. What we know so far is that the person who was in charge of publications for the Congress of Cultural Freedom, so that's François Bondy, he was in close contact with one of the editors of Merkur. He informally advised him on editorial decisions. They met pretty often. They privately sent issues of the magazines that they published in their own country, respectively, to each other. They did translate works that were published in each magazine. And at some point, Merkur runs into financial trouble. And at that point, François Bondy tries to advocate with the Congress for Cultural Freedom to subsidize Merkur as well. I have not found so far any evidence pointing to funding having actually being approved by the Congress for Cultural Freedom, but definitely we can see that there's at least an informal network there that ties these two publications together. And that was one of the really unexpected contributions of this kind of graph. So, and now I will actually pass over to Dana so that she can tell us more about the Congress for Cultural Freedom and the work in the archive.
Yeah, perfect transition. So in my research, as Marina and Andrew have already told you, I have been largely focusing on the German magazine Der Monat. You can see a couple of issues here on the left. Der Monat was a German language magazine that was published from 1948 until 1971. And it was editorially led in the beginning and also funded throughout most of its existence by Americans. So as a product of American-German cooperation in the American sector of post-war Germany, the goals of Der Monat were very much in line with the general aim at the time of reorienting the German people after the end of the Second World War and sort of denazifying them, re-democratizing them, and so forth. But it also became very quickly an important weapon in the sort of newly forming battle between the West and the East in the Cold War, which is also where the Congress for Cultural Freedom comes in. The Congress for Cultural Freedom started funding Der Monat a bit later on. It didn't start off with Der Monat, but actually sort of out of Der Monat, the main editor-in-chief of Der Monat in the beginning was Marvin Lasky, an American, and he instituted the first official sort of meeting of the Congress for Cultural Freedom. The Congress then became, aside from a place for intellectuals to meet, it was a network of a sort of anti-communist league of influences, shall we say. And it later became also well known in the 60s that the Congress for Cultural Freedom was a partial front of the CIA. Through the Congress for Cultural Freedom, magazines like Der Monat, but also like the British Encounter and the French Preuve were funded by the American Secret Service. So despite this very obvious connection of to American politics, Der Monat itself always displayed itself throughout its existence as a very international magazine. You can see the subtitle of the magazine is Eine internationale Zeitschrift, so an international magazine. And additionally to this, the longtime correspondents of Der Monat were also predominantly well-known international writers, philosophers, intellectuals, all of whom stood in contact, or most of whom stood in contact with the Congress for Cultural Freedom, such as François Bondy, whom Marina has already mentioned, but also Arthur Koestler, Ivan Crystal, who later worked on Encounter as well. The visibility of these international voices is especially high in the early years of Der Monat, where if you could look at the graph in the middle, 10 texts out of an average of 17 texts in the magazine, in each issue of the magazine, were actually translated into German. And if you remember back to the first table that Marina showed you of translations in Encounter, you will realize that I think it was already the second issue of Encounter that had no translations at all. For Der Monat, it was issue 161. That is the first translation without the first issue without any translations at all. So translation plays a central role, a much more central role than the other CCF magazines for the setup of Der Monat. And that is also the reason why while looking through Der Monat, making my way through the magazines and sort of adding the data to our tables, I found it impossible not to feel a degree of frustration with the magazine's translation policy, or rather the lack of visibility when it comes to translation. Because the editorial practice of Der Monat was to give all the credit to the original authors and not to name the translators. So only, as Marina has also told you, this was was an exemption for most of our magazines, the translators of poetry, so of verse, were named in the pages of the magazine, but other translators were not named, and also most of the time it is completely unclear whether a text is even translated, which makes it very hard for somebody going through the magazine trying to figure out how many of these texts were translated material. In one of the very few comments on their own translation practices that I found in the pages of the magazine, this is the picture you can see on the right-hand side here. This is in answer to a reader asking a question to the editorial team, and then the editorial team answers in the parentheses under here. And something that they say is that in general, the translations in the columns of Der Monat are the result of teamwork by the editorial team and the consulted freelancers. So they very much make it their policy not to name translators. So for me, this meant, in order to gain insight into the decisions made in the translation process and in order to identify more of these anonymous translators that I had added into the tables for Der Monat, I then turned to archival material. And that is the next slide. So last autumn, Marina and I visited the Hannah Holborn Gray Special Collections Research Center at the University of Chicago. And while Marina made her way through an even larger collection of material on the Congress for Cultural Freedom and also on Preuve, I dove headfirst into the archival material that they had there for Der Monat. We are both still in the process of sorting through everything that we found in Chicago in order to decide what materials to focus on, because as you can imagine, it's quite a lot. But I can tell you already that the archival material was a big help in identifying the translation practices of Der Monat in a number of ways. So firstly, sifting through the correspondences unveiled a few of those previously invisible translators who were working on the magazine. You can see here in the picture on the left, that is an example of translators being named in the correspondences. This one is a particularly lucky one because it's just a list of names and the pieces that they worked on. This is the biggest sort of gold vein that I found for Der Monat, but I know that Marina found quite a lot of these for Preuve at least. The second thing that we were able to find is that some of the archival material was able to give us insight into the finances of the magazines, and that means also into the sort of the compensation that was paid for translation work. And two things that I found here were, for example, I found a contract for one of the co-editors of the magazine, who was a German man, Helmut Jesrich, who worked on the magazine for a long time, later became sort of the main editor-in-chief as well. And it shows that around 1953, he was paid 350 mark for a translation, which is much higher than the price that I found written on another note. This is the memorandum you can see here in the middle displayed, which there is a handwritten note which says that translations are to be paid 8 mark per page. So per page typescript, so the printed page would have been a bit higher, and then it also gives other numbers for photographs and so on that were published. So I'm not entirely sure if those were the going rates of Der Monat, but in either case there is a difference between what the editor or later editor-in-chief was paid and what other translators were paid. And besides allowing both Marina and I to fill in some of those missing names for our tables and gaining some information on the finances of the magazines, the documents in Chicago also provided me with support for some of the hypotheses that I had formed while going through Der Monat about their own editorial practices. What surprised me perhaps the most about the material that I found in Chicago was the sheer amount of letters from translators, mostly women and mostly also titled academics, who wrote to the offices of Der Monat asking for work, sometimes in very desperate fashion. This is the next slide. So this is just a portion of the correspondences belonging into this category, and I'm still sorting through some of the pictures I've taken because I believe there are still a couple more that belong in this category. So all of these are from the years 1949 to 1950. All of these offers are by women, and all of these were rejected by the magazine. The reason given for these rejections was, on the one hand, that giving translation work to someone who lived outside of Berlin, which is where the magazine was produced, would simply cost too much time in the editorial process. And the second reason that was sort of the through line through all of these answers that I found to these letters that was repeated again and again was a sort of formulaic answer, as vague as the answer to the letter to the editor that I found in the magazine itself, which simply said that translation was being done in-house or by an already assembled team of freelancers that Der Monat felt somewhat responsible for keeping on once they started working with them. Speaking of those, I also found a bit of information on them. In June 1948, so in the first year of Der Monat being published, Melvin Lasky, the editor-in-chief at the time, he mentions in a letter to the American military who had been sponsoring the publication of the magazine at the beginning, he mentions that a, quote, apparatus of editors, assistants, translators, and typists exists now who have been working for Der Monat. And some of the contracts of the editors that I found in the personnel files who were working for the magazine also prove what I had assumed from that note as an answer to the letter to the editor, that translation was actually done by the editorial team itself. So in the contract that I showed you earlier for Helmut Jesrich, it is officially stated that one of his duties is to translate at least one article per issue, and that was what he was paid those 350 marks for. So it wasn't a sort of extra price that he was paid, but it was as part of his salary. He was always supposed to do at least one translation. Additionally, to all of this, the correspondences on translation also show that the freelancers, those who are still the very much invisible people working on Der Monat, who translated for Der Monat, especially early on, were highly criticized by both the editorial team and also by the original authors of the text. I've brought one example, which is the next slide, where in 1949, so answering to basically the first issues of Der Monat in 48 being published, Hannah Arendt exchanges a couple of letters with the editors in which she criticizes the translation work done in the first few issues of Der Monat. And here she says, among other things, I know how hard good translation work is, and I have so many objections to the American rewrite method that I hesitate to recommend it to you. But this is not working. Or rather, if you let it go on like this, any boy whose mother tongue is German will be able to give you a run for their money. And she goes in this very first letter, she goes into detail, quoting certain phrases that have been wrongly translated in the editorial that she is working on. Later on, as you see here on the right-hand side, she then comments again on this issue, saying that it might be best to publish the names of the translators alongside the names of the original authors in order for those translators to be held responsible for the, up to this point, very bad job that they have been doing. Sadly, the editorial team did not take this advice to heart. That would have made my job a lot easier. All of this, by the way, ultimately results in Arendt translating her own work for Der Monat. So texts that she at that time wrote in English first because she was publishing in America. She then translated and was paid for the translation of those texts into German and then published in Der Monat. And she's not the only author to self-translate for Der Monat. An additional hypothesis that we sort of had collectively before going to Chicago concerned the Congress for Cultural Freedom. So that's the next slide. Before going to Chicago, we had kind of heard rumors and read some vague notes about a editorial meeting between the magazines. So mainly because those are the three that interest us the most, Der Monat, and then on the British side Encounter, and on the French side Preuve, that all of these who were sponsored by the Congress for Cultural Freedom would at one point have met, the editorial teams would have met together and had editorial meetings together. And in Chicago, Marina and I were able to confirm that these meetings, at least for a time, took place. So for a span of about 3 to 4 years, I have notes on the editorial meetings as well as agendas for what was supposed to happen at these editorial meetings. From Lasky, who was sort of spearheading those meetings, I have the notes because Lasky was the one working on their Monat. So in the Monat archive, we found a lot of his memorandums, and there among those were the notes for these editorial meetings. And from those, we can conclude that the CCF magazines worked on special issues together, that they divided the work of sort of courting authors or getting correspondents on board for one of the magazines between each other. So somebody who had connections to a writer they wanted to have published in their magazines would reach out and get them to work for their magazine, for example, their Monat, and then it would be very easy for them to suggest to that author that they could just publish a translation of that text in Encounter or a French translation in Preuve. The three magazines, and later on it very quickly became a larger number of magazines that participated at these editorial meetings. They also decided how to best approach certain topics as a sort of united front in these editorial meetings. I found, for example, one discussion about how to approach the topic of the poor, and they discussed two different angles that they could approach this from. They also planned new CCF-sponsored publications together at these meetings. And then finally, because as you can see from the agenda, most of these meetings started with each of the editors presenting sort of the last issue that they had done. These meetings were also spaces for criticism between the magazines, and especially in the beginning, where Der Monat had already been much longer established, and Preuve and then Encounter were just funded, which were founded a bit later on in early 50s. You can see that this group of editors getting together is very much working on how is Encounter, for example, supposed to look? What do we feel like could be done better in response to the earliest issues of the magazine? So in conclusion, while we were not able to answer all our questions by just going to the archive once, the archival material has definitely given us a wealth of new insights into magazines like Der Monat and the structures that surrounded them. So our time in the archive gave us a much better understanding of how a continent-spanning institution like the Congress for Cultural Freedom functioned, and how the communication between the magazines worked, and what role, of course, translation played throughout the whole process.
Thank you, Dana. I'm just going to pick up just the final segment, just to look at Stephen Spender and Encounter, but I'm going to I'm just going to jump over a little bit, which is kind of background setting, which is but I'll put the quote up, and people can look back on these. This is really setting up some of the how Spender came to the idea of editing a magazine that he was interested in, a magazine that was like an international review for Europe, and this is from a conversation he had in 1945 with the German novelist Ernst Junger. But at the back of this idea of a kind of pan-European magazine was the thoughts of another person, which again I'm going to jump through, which is T.S. Eliot, and some quotes there from Eliot. Eliot gave a lecture, a set of lectures broadcast on German radio in 1945 called The Unity of European Culture, which was then published in due course, where yet again Eliot thought about, a bit like Spender, thought about the idea of an international review or a network of independent reviews across Europe. And he looked back to the work that he did in Criterion, the magazine he edited from 1922 onwards, and thought very much about the importance of translation for transmitting ideas. And if you look at the very first issue of the Criterion we've got here, we see that translation was there from the start, with a couple of the pieces, the essay by Valérie Larbeau and Hermann Hesse as well as that minor poem, The Wasteland. But just to then move to what I wanted to say just about Encounter and Preuve. So Dana has really kind of set this up nicely by saying, there are close links, and we found the trilingual archive that she looked at, close links between Preuve, Der Monat and Encounter. They would often share translated material. So on the left-hand side, the piece by Arthur Koestler about the La Bombe Ash and the dinosaur was indeed published in translation in De Monat, and yet again in Encounter. So there's a kind of movement of translated material across these magazines as if they are some kind of a network, perhaps in the way that Eliot envisaged. So I just want to focus on Encounter then in particular, and this is just a representative issue with quite a nice cover and a nice couple of points I wanted to make about it. We've looked at the period, we've gathered the data from 53 to 65. The editors were Spender, who was invited by the CCF to become an editor. The other editor at the start was Irving Kristol, and then Lasky, who had been the founder and editor of De Monat, was involved. It should be said that Spender always claimed that he knew nothing about the funding from the CIA. And most of the accounts seem to indicate that's probably true. Certainly we think Lasky and Kristol and a number of the other people knew where the money was going. It went through a kind of front organization. So one of the questions, of course, the editorial independence of these magazines, which is a matter of huge debate in the literature and the archive. But just kind of focusing on translation and Encounter, there are 147 issues that we've looked at in this period. There are 169 instances of translation from 18 different languages. So though 59 is across the corpus, there's only 18 in Encounter, which is still relatively large. 75 different translators identified, of which only 8 are female. So in contrast to the material in Carousel that Marina talks about, where it was about half and half male and female, the Encounter is a very kind of blokey magazine, should we say, both in its contributors, but also its reliance on its translators. This is a kind of an interesting one from the point of translation. It has the first part of Lévi-Strauss's Triste Tropique there, so it's kind of an interesting text to have in this, key work in anthropology and structural anthropology and so on. One of the things that's interesting about this, if you look at the contents page, that you think, oh, well, it is a very blokey magazine. It's all men. From there, and we look on the contents page. But one of the things they forgot was there's a poem by Sylvia Plath in this issue, which isn't listed on the contents page, which was actually published at the end of the translation of Triste Tropique. So, I'm not sure what went on there, but I mean, it's just a bit of bad, editorial proofreading, really. But it's kind of symptomatic, maybe, of some of the focus of this magazine. And just to use some of the work that Marina's done on the data with this one. Across those 169, 170 translations, the majority, 20% is from German, 17% Russian, 16% French, and 13% Polish. And that's kind of interesting in its way, because if you add up for example, the Russian and the Polish, that's 30%, almost a third, 33% of the material is from these two languages, which, as you remember, the De Monat wasn't as common, and you kind of think, well, okay, why is that? Well, once we start to look at some other data, and I think Marina was said about the data across the years, we can start to kind of answer some of that. Encounter was a CCF magazine. It was the front was promoting an anti-communist line. So publishing dissident material from Russia and Poland would obviously at various points be high on its agenda. We look here at what we get with Polish, and we see from 57 onwards, there's a big spike. So I think it's, a key kind of Polish writers are then translated, and this is the kind of attempt to say, look, this is what is happening behind the Iron Curtain. So we have that with Polish. We have something similar with Russian, a bit of a spike from 59, dips, but then it picks up again. German is a kind of another example that starts off not so much, and then that increases. And one of the things I think we'd say about all of these, the first spike is around about 59, 60 there. And what happens to the editorship of the magazine is that is the moment when Melvin Lasky joins it. So Lasky is a kind of key figure then in steering the magazine to more translation, we might say, both of the German material, but also the material from Russia and Poland. One final point about translation here, we've mentioned the way in which, you know, we focus on these 3 language areas, but we do want to look across at other language areas that have been translated. In 1958, Encounter offered a prize alongside International Pen for the best English translation of a short story written in either an Asian, Arabic or African language. Now, there's a couple of interesting points to say about this. One is that these are the judges, Graham Greene, Spender, Angus Wilson, Gerald Hopkins, and as far as I know, they spoke none of these languages. So it's a kind of puzzle. But then if you look at the entry requirements, it said the translation only should be submitted, though a version in the original language should be available for the judges if asked for. So they're not really asking to judge the best translation from a text. They're judging which is the most interesting story for these kind of 4 Anglophone judges. First prize was given to this person, Hwang Soon Won, who's a really well-known Korean writer. But yet again, we can just see in the little box there where they give the information. They say this has been translated from the Korean by Yu E Sang, won a prize in our recent authors and translation story. So they give the identity of the translator, but more of the focus, I think, is on the person that did the translation. The key question, I suppose, I would just want to say, or the key point I would make about it, is why were they interested in Asian, Arabic and African languages? And I think we have to go back to the mission of the CCF and the desire of them to reach, as again, some of the archival material that I was looking at that Dana's provided to me. There was a desperate attempt for the CCF to reach beyond Europe into other areas of the world in which communist or possible communist influence might occur. They started a magazine in India, a magazine in Japan, and so on. So I think this translation prize in these areas is not just a kind of internationalism, but also is linked to the kind of political goals behind these magazines. So just to finish, this is kind of winding up something that Marina was saying. So some of the things that we want to do long term in terms of digital humanities, use the outcomes from merging the databases, as she suggested, to investigate some larger trends in translation activity and flow. Use the data visualizations, as she suggested, and mapping geographical movement. So once we've got the data, we can start to do a whole number of interesting things and try to address issues, questions, problematics that we've found. And we will make the databases publicly accessible, and all the kind of metadata will be available on GitHub when we finish. Final slide, just some future activities to flag up. I've just been involved in setting up an exhibition in Nottingham. Should anybody be in Nottingham between now and the end of the 11th of March, which shows some of the material. This is based on an earlier exhibition that was held in Germersheim. 2024, next year, we're going to hope to have the website launched, but we're also holding our final project conference in Germersheim. Again, we'd hope to see a number of people at that. Because it's ESPRit, I should mention we're hoping to have a special issue of JEPS that was papers from the first workshop that we did. We've got a second special issue for a different journal focused on translation. And finally, we're planning from the conference and other activities to have a final book publication, which will be open access. So I hope, we've gone on a little bit longer than perhaps we intended, but we hope that's given you a good kind of overview of some of the different aspects of the project, and we'd very much welcome kind of questions or comments.